Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Econ Playground. I'm here again with two guests. The first is Dylan Pahman, who I had on about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, to talk about some work that he was doing that became this book, The Kingdom of God and the Common Good. And Dylan is a research fellow at the Acton Institute, but he's also now, since this is development, since the last video we did together, is the founder and president of the Nicholas Kabasilas Institute, in which I'm also a research fellow. And I've got Nicholas Kabasilas here, an icon of him right behind me that I was encouraged to get by Sherry. So I did a video with her on her channel, Restoring Meaning. We talked about Nicholas Kabasilas a little bit, and so you can go check that out if you want. And so Sherry and I both want to talk to Dylan about some of his more recent work, some things that he talks about a little bit in his book, but a particular person, that is S.L. Frank. I'll let you pronounce the full name, Dylan, who's an
Sure.
Orthodox thinker from the early 20th century. So, Dylan, tell us a little bit about who S.L. Frank is and why you're interested in him and why we should be reading him more.
Yeah, so he was a Russian Orthodox philosopher. Actually, I don't know if you want, but I do have slides from the paper when I presented it, so I can
Oh,
also
no
pull those
kidding.
up.
Yeah.
But that would, that's if you want to let me talk for like 20 minutes. But I
Yeah.
can summarize. But maybe I'll pull up a slide or two at the end to help
Okay.
us
Yeah. Well, if
kind of
you have a particular
conceptualize
thing you want
things.
to share, yeah.
But so he was born in, I believe, 1877 to a Jewish family in Moscow. I believe his grandfather was one of the founders of the synagogue, or at least he was heavily
Mm.
involved there. Um, his father died when he was 5 years old. And so he was raised kind of by his grandfather and stepfather. Grandfather died when he was a teenager. And then the stepfather, so his grandfather was kind of tutoring him in his Jewish faith, teaching him Hebrew, all that kind of stuff, the Torah. But the stepfather was into more radical stuff. And so once the grandfather died, Frank became, enamored with Marxism, became an atheist. It was very common, actually, of young kind of aristocrats in the late 19th century. But like many, he ended up having a journey back to faith, I think around when he was 20 years old, although it took him about 10 more years before he ended up joining the Orthodox Church. He was baptized in 1912. Um, and from that point on, he's very much a religious philosopher, and so he's this guy who had this training in a lot of the German idealism. His family even had connections to Germany, so he studied in Berlin, and he was one of the contributors to a very interesting volume called Veki, which is Russian for landmarks, and it was
Mm.
sort of this like victory lap that the Russian religious intellectuals took after a failed revolution from the more radical atheistic ones, and it's kind of unfortunately serves as a warning today that maybe don't celebrate too soon because 8 years later the revolution came, right? But like many, he was exiled in 1922 because his philosophy didn't fit the party line, and so he went to Berlin because he had connections there. But that was a pretty terrible place to go for not just for a Slav, but someone who's ethnically Jewish. And so by 1937, he had to flee. He and his family, like his sons, I believe, were questioned by the SS a few times, and really kind of got out just in time. But where did he go? Well, he went to Paris, and 3 years later, the Nazis showed up. You have the fall of Paris, and so he sent his adult children to London, and he and his wife hid out in the mountains near Grenoble. All during this time, he's still writing. In fact, this
Mm.
like might be the most fruitful time. Writing like deep philosophy. He wrote God with Us, which is kind of his personal confession, while hiding out near Grenoble. Like he literally, like they went and slept outside on the ground some nights to hide from the SS. And he was
Mm.
scribbling this down and then mailing it to his son in London, who was then
Mm.
transcribing it and then eventually had it translated. So just an incredibly amazing life. His biographer, calls it a remarkable life, and I think that's an understatement, right? And throughout all this time, his experience of Christianity is orthodoxy. He's very ecumenical, very generous, maybe too much so for some people. But still, when it comes down to a lot of the East-West differences, he's always coming down on the side of the East, because that's what he knew and experienced. And he wrote about so many things. He was this deep philosopher that could talk about epistemology and ontology, but basically every single one of his works eventually gets to our social life. Talks about things like politics and economics, and even questions towards the end of his work about World War and the atomic bomb, and that
Mm.
kind of stuff. And he's an interesting parallel to people like Richard or Reinhold Niebuhr, or I mean, he even refers to his philosophy as Christian realism, although it kind of means something different. Um, but it shows that the Orthodox Church was right there as part of this ongoing Christian conversation about the big problems of modern life. Um, but he died in 1950 in London. He was reunited with his children after the war. There's been a few exceptions, but for the most part, Orthodox thinkers have been focused on other things since then. I think very understandably so. They were refugees in the West, and they wanted to know, well, what makes us Orthodox and not Western? And so they focused a bit more on kind of ecumenical discussions. And again, it's not like they never said anything, but really nothing comparable to Frank, in my opinion. And
Mm.
he's been really interestingly obscured compared to some of his contemporaries. He knew Sergei Bulgakov, he knew St. Maria Skobtsova, he knew Nikolai Berdyaev. There's all sorts of people that, like, if you're at least in the Orthodox world, you've heard of them, right? Especially if you're a reader. And then Frank, I don't see him quoted or cited as much, but he was well regarded by his contemporaries. V.V. Zemkovsky, who's this historian of Russian philosophy, called him the greatest of the Russian philosophers at the time. And anyway, I could go on and on. Just
Mm.
fascinating person, and really subtle thinker, that I think has a lot of insights that are not simply original, but they're original in that while he doesn't always seem to acknowledge it, because I think it was just the air that he breathed, it's actually very rooted in our Orthodox tradition. My whole paper that I sent you guys that you read, really argues for the patristic antecedents to his thought. So, there are some times where the ways in which he says it might be a little, obtuse, or, unconventional. But I think a lot of it in substance actually is this really interesting, neo-patristic synthesis, to use Father George Florovsky's term. So
Yeah.
that's who he is. That's why I think we ought to pay attention to what he wrote. I really hope we can get some of his works back in print so more people can read them.
Yeah, that'd be great. I guess one question about him before we start talking about the ideas a little bit more is this period. I didn't realize that he was writing during, because this book, the main book that I looked at was the Spiritual Foundations of Society, which is
Yeah.
1930, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, but I didn't realize that he had this period writing during the war. Do you think that his experience as an exile and as somebody who was persecuted for being a minority, even if, for being a Jewish minority, even if he didn't necessarily identify fully as a Jew religiously, right? Did that color his religious or his political, social, theological beliefs at all different from any of his contemporaries, perhaps?
I think so. So there's a recurring theme throughout his works. I've read basically everyone I can get my hands on in English. There's, I think, six that have been translated. When he talks about, the world in its fallen state, and our life in the state of sin, he constantly returns to this idea of being homeless, or being
Mm.
exiles, or being, apart from our homeland. The kingdom of God and God Himself is our true homeland. And I think additionally, and this is something apparently he told his family, didn't really affect it that much when his father died. But this is something that actually comes up again and again. He also refers to us as orphaned over and over again. And then he emphasizes just the beauty and the redemptive message of God being our father. And so I think his biography really does play into it. And I believe his son, um, I think it was his son Victor, said something like his works are his biography. And so I actually think, and sometimes you can do a little too much reading into it, the kind of over historicizing. But I think there's some legitimacy to that with Frank and his work. I think that his experience really shaped his thought. You can see similar themes maybe in his early writings before he was exiled, but it's very pronounced. Beginning in there's a series of lectures from I believe 1923. That's actually really readable. I really wish that one would come into print. It's called The Meaning of Life,
Mm,
but it's already there. He's talking to a bunch of Russian students, and it's very natural, right? He's going to talk to them about being exiles, but then he's also going to talk about, well, what's our true homeland, right? It's not exactly Russia, right? Not if we're Christians, In one sense, it might be for a Russian student. Of course, they were hoping that it would be a temporary thing instead of 70-year long period of communism. But
mhm,
he really kind of assures them that there's a deeper, truer sense of the word homeland, and that's the kingdom of God.
mhm. So the main concept or the main term that a lot of other people have probably heard of, um, and then the other one that maybe people have not heard as much is sobornos. That's a term that comes up a lot. It comes up in other thinkers of the time as well. Bulgakov talks about it, and
Hmm.
some others. But then also he has this complementary term, obsheственnost, right? So could you
Yes.
talk about those two? Because those, whatever we talk about, those are going to be either coming up explicitly or implicitly in everything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So he talks about these in terms of two different, strata of our social life, two different aspects of community. So there's one in which a community is a bunch of people, right? Whatever the relation may be to each other, and it might be imposed upon them. So, being assigned to a group in a classroom or happening to be born into a certain community that has a certain law or legal system to it. That's kind of this externally imposed community that if you violate the boundaries, you're disciplined. Um, on the other hand, the truest relationships have a more organic, inner spiritual connection. And he talks about this in terms that's associated with philosophical personalism. So in like the Roman Catholic world, people like Jacques Maritain, um, and actually, one of the earliest writers in this tradition would be Martin Buber, who is
Mm.
Jewish. But the
I think
idea that
Polanyi as well, Michael Polanyi
yes,
is
yeah, there's quite
associated
a
with it.
few 20th
Yeah.
century thinkers. There's sort of like a Christian answer to, although not exclusively Christian, but Christian answer to existentialism in some ways, a lot less pessimistic. And it emphasizes that, this is the difference between he, she, and they, third person pronouns,
Mm.
somebody I'm observing and describing, and I, you, and we, right? A community to which I belong. And what's interesting about his thought, so Sobornost is that inner community, right? That spiritual connection between people. Občestvenost is that external, imposed or mechanical, he says, community. What's interesting about his thought is that he actually doesn't say that, well, we need the former and not the latter. He actually says that doesn't matter what community you're part of, there's always both. And
Yeah.
what you need is to actually properly respect and value both. And that, you only get this kind of mechanical order if you also have that inner unity and
Hmm.
somewhat vice versa. And it leads him to this very healthy and balanced perspective on a lot of social questions.
Hmm. Yeah, and then he can still have conviction, but it's
Yes.
not. Yeah. Yeah. You had something, Sherry?
Well, I just wanted to, because when I was reading that, there were a couple things from Florensky that came to my mind because I'm more familiar with him. I'm just starting to read Frank, but one of them is the uh, when Florensky talks about the objective and the subjective, he never talks about them in an either or way. And it seems to me that that's kind of what Frank is doing as well. That there is an objective world, right, out there, the thing in itself, and then there's your subjective experience of that thing. And and then the other thing that came up for me a lot was the idea of it seems to me that he favors, and like I said, I haven't read much of his work yet, the organic, right, over the mechanistic. So everything has to, but I'm a farmer. So when I'm reading things like this, I'm going, okay, how does that work in the natural world? And when you plant a seed, you plant it in the dark,
Mm,
right? And it's alone.
mm,
And it has to develop. It has to grow roots. It has to listen to its hormonal system, and some of it goes up and some of it goes down, and before it emerges into its community, right?
hmm
So I see a lot of and then of course that whole being in the dark is it's a subjective experience. Like,
hmm
there's nobody to talk to about that. You can't even see.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and then of course when you emerge into your community, you emerge into a community that is unknown to you.
Mm.
It's like, and I'm thinking about this in plant terms, okay? Like, there are microbes in the soil, there's mycelium in the soil, networks, that are providing you with nutrients that you're not aware of, and then you're introduced to a whole world of other plants, you know.
hmm
Um,
Mhm.
Anyways, and plants are interesting. They're an interesting example actually because they cooperate with each other. Like
Mm.
as a gardener, growing a vegetable garden for many years, one of the things I used to be amazed at was I'd have a row of potatoes, and in that row of potatoes, I would have weeds that looked like potato plants,
Hmm.
and they wouldn't be anywhere else.
Hmm.
There's a
Yeah.
cooperation there, right?
hmm
They're all cooperating. Somebody's providing something to somebody, you know, to allow them to be there, you know? Anyway,
hmm
so those are just some random
Yeah,
thoughts.
I
But I,
like
Right.
the I
yeah.
like the example though, because Frank talks about these two realities with a lot of different terms. And so one of the things he talks about is the relationship between grace and the law, right? Or we could even just say the
Mhm.
gospel and the law. And I believe it's St. John Cassian, or at least one of the monks in his conferences. He uses this to talk about our salvation. He says, uh, God sends the rain and the sunshine, right? God's the one who makes the seed and the soil. But we actually have to go out and like till the ground and we have to do the work, right? And we don't just do all that and then say, I made this grow. Because if God didn't send the rain and the sunshine, all of that, if there wasn't that organic basis to it, nothing would have grown at all. On the
And
other
it's
hand, there is the mechanical side of the farmer themselves, right? The work that you do also helps shape the community of those plants or those crops. And I think that's kind of the dynamic he wants us to see in our social life,
right,
really in our spiritual life too. He does think that ultimately, the soil that we need to be rooted in is God Himself.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The one
Just
of the things from what you said, Sherry, one of the things that he brings up right at the beginning when he's talking about the differences between them, he doesn't really define their content yet or their essence yet, if that's even the right word. He just starts saying, well, obshestvenos, that's the one that seems almost more obvious. This is empirical reality. It's the thing that you can see, it's the thing that you can measure, it's the thing that you can account for. Whereas sobornost is around and undergirding everything, and people have a subjective experience of it, but when you're trying to observe society, you're not going to see it just from things that you can measure and account for. And you can know that Sobornost is a part of constituting this order, and it's a necessary part of constituting it, but it's a part that you're not going to be able to account for in the same way. So it reminded me of a lot of the things that I read in Bulgakov, where it's almost as if when we're doing social science, even, right? The stable, easy, clear to measure things are are part of more the obshestvenost part of the order, but you can do social science in a way that, you're studying the external measurable parts, but you still respect the fact that there are things that you can't measure, right? The fact that there's some things that you can't measure doesn't ruin all of the fact that you did actually measure something, find a real pattern. You did actually know and learn something. And that's the that difference between these different kinds of orders and what parts can be known and what parts cannot be known are so thoroughly integrated with Hayek's thought, right? So when I was
Yes.
reading this, Hayek was screaming back at me, and I was like,
Yes.
"This is kind of amazing." And Hayek is on the other side of Polanyi as well, right?
hmm hmm
And so he also uses the terms that sort of correspond but they're not identical to sobernos and obsessionos, which is spontaneity versus planning. Now, I
Yep.
understand this is a translation, but spontaneity immediately makes me think of spontaneous order, which is
Hmm.
the Hayek and Polanyi's term for some kind of order that develops organically, versus, and he literally uses the word, again, it's a translation, organization, to refer to the other one. And so
Yep.
Hayek's two words for that in his magnum opus are cosmos and taxis, right?
Hmm.
Cosmos, which I think, Sherry, I've shown you some of that stuff before. Um, I had a video about it about a couple years ago that I made, that the cosmos, the way that Hayek describes the cosmos is when all of the different elements that are constituting this order are there because they're following rules. It's a little bit of a weird construction. They're following rules, whereas a taxis, each element is placed, right,
Right.
in some pattern to make a larger order. And
Yeah.
the important difference that a lot of people skip over is that for a taxis to be orderable, whoever is doing the planning, whoever is doing the ordering, needs a certain degree of knowledge. The things that he's ordering, he has to, all the pattern in which he's going to order them, the relationships he's going to give between them, he has to only make based on external things. Oh, I matched the reds with the reds and the greens with the greens, or something like that, right? Whereas you need some kind of voluntary action. You need each element to go to look at the rule and go, oh, I have this private knowledge, which a planner can't know, and I respond to this situation, sort of offering up the thing that I know secretly, privately, and that will create a larger order, which someone who's only looking at the external could not do. And that's Hayek in the 1970s is writing that. And the things he says all earlier in his career relate to it. He doesn't really say it so clearly until the 70s, but S.L. Frank beat him to the chase already. Maybe even better.
No, I totally agree with that. I actually have an essay I wrote that I'm waiting to hear from a publisher,
Oh, cool.
basically doing exactly that, comparing Hayek and Frank on this question. Hayek talks about, he kind of laments that English doesn't really have two different words for order. So you have
Hmm.
to either modify it, or he says, well, maybe we could use the Greek. And so he has cosmos and taxis, right?
Hmm.
But Russian had two terms. Sobornos comes from the Old Slavonic translation of the Nicene Creed. It's the word for Catholic. And in the ancient church, that didn't just mean universal, it was holistic. It's literally through the whole is what the Greek means.
Hmm.
It's that again, that spiritual unity, right? That respects the fullness of reality and the fullness of human life. And then yeah, the obches venos is this kind of more mechanical side. Um, I don't know,
Can I
maybe I
just
should,
add?
yeah, go
Can I,
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I just have to say it because it just keeps screaming at me in the back of my mind. Florensky talks about Sophia as not merely creation, but as all integral creation, right? And it seems to me that I'm not familiar with Hayek at all. But it seems to me that that's what they're pointing at, right? That like this is the problem with for me with duality is it's always either this or either that because we're always looking for this perfect solution to the problem. And and because things are integral by nature, like that's why I use the example of mycelium and microbes and
Hmm.
that's the
Yeah.
unknowable that Frank I think is talking about, right? It's you can't know it because you can't
Hmm.
see it, right?
Hmm.
Right.
But anyway, so I just wanted to point that out because, Sophia is wisdom.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that that's what you guys are looking for, right?
Yeah.
In the institute is what is not the best way or the right way, but what is the wisest way to
Mm.
approach these things? And I think I don't know if I was doing what you're doing. I'm not. But as a woman, I can tell you what to do. Um,
Okay.
I would just keep in mind that wisdom, Sophia, is all integral,
Mm.
right? So it's
Hmm.
never going to be easy, right?
Right.
It's never good. It's a like it's a mesh. It's a web. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah, so one of the institute's core principles is divine wisdom and spontaneous order for exactly this reason. Now, I should say, just to add some nuance, Frank was not actually a sophiologist like Bulgakov and Florensky, and he was familiar with their work, so he very easily could have used that same terminology. But even so, I do think you're right that there's still a lot they share in common. But it makes me think of, Adam Smith actually talks about how there are certain orders, in this case, he doesn't use the term, but spontaneous order is what he's talking about, that are the result of human action, but not of human design. And he says we often just mistake this. We give ourselves the credit because we say, well, it's people doing the thing. He says, when in reality, it's the wisdom of God. Right. That even
Mhm.
in the foundation of economics, the modern economics, the kind of father of the whole discipline, and really a lot of the earliest economists after him were clergy of various sorts, and very, would definitely affirm this perspective that what they're observing is God's wisdom in caring for us. That the butcher goes to market and he's concerned about providing for his family, but in so doing, he provides somebody else's meal, right? And you have through exchange this emergent order that comes about. Definitely something we plan to keep pretty central to our work. Yeah. Um, yeah,
You
I
know,
like that a lot. And Ferensky is someone who we could probably do a whole different episode all about him. I really like how he outlines the relationship between Sophia and friendship in his
Yes.
book. And I have a whole section of my book where I talk about that as well.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
we should do that because I would love to hear your. I'm fully enamored with
Mm.
Florensky.
so I want to go because I'm an Adam Smith guy, right? So
Yeah,
I want to go to the butcher comment that you made, right? Because
sure.
as Frank has a I forget exactly at which part, but he brings up that kind of thing where he says, "Oh, someone might see the relationship between two people bargaining over a good in the marketplace or a worker capitalist relationship. These are all cold utilitarian, right? This is all people ordering by общественность, right?
Hmm.
Um, by just I'm corresponding to what is going on in the contract that's XYZ, things like that, right? I'm seeking maximizing profits, blah blah blah, right? But then he says, well, there has to be something undergirding that makes
Hmm.
them able to interact, that it makes that exchange possible, right? You could describe certain aspects of their relationship in cold utilitarian terms, he says, but there has to be, well, the first thing he says is some kind of underlying trust, right?
Hmm.
That some kind of feeling that, oh, I don't expect this person to just, totally screw me over in this deal. There has to be some kind of baseline honesty. Now, when I first saw that, I mean, I'm trained to criticize all of these things as much as I possibly can as an economist, where I go, oh, well, the trust, that's based on these other institutions that are also cold utilitarian things, right? And oh, the fact that they know that they're going to be trading with each other tomorrow. So really, it's not that they care about the other person. They trust them based on the expectation that the other person is trying to keep up their reputation in the marketplace. But I mean, we talk about that all the time as economists, but there's so many situations in which it's actually not the case. But what I'm really glad he brought up is I noted that down. I was like, maybe a weakness. He should have talked about this other thing. In the next paragraph, he talked about that other thing, which is language, right? He says
Hmm.
another thing that's very important is that for a trade to be possible, there has to be some kind of genuine meeting of the minds. There has to be just like the simple possibility of communication in the first place. And that's actually the context. Language is the context of the butcher and baker passage in The Wealth
Hmm.
of Nations, right?
Hmm.
Because that whole section, people know, well, they think of this passage, it's not from benevolence of the butcher, baker, and brewer that I expect my bread, but I address them with regard to their own self-interest, right? Um, is people think of that as just, oh, Smith is describing human beings, people that are motivated primarily by their own profit,
Right.
right? But
Right. Right.
really, it's in the context of, well, what would communication have to be like with strangers, right? The
Hmm.
whole chapter is basically saying why are humans the trading animal? Why are humans the animal that develops these larger orders? Because we have a capacity for language. Because in a sense we have a capacity to perceive unity that other animals do not get to perceive in the same way. right? So we
Right.
can we maybe, if you want to use the word Sophia, we can perceive the natural relationships or the integration between these different things that in a certain empirical observation look like they're completely separate and alienated. Because we can see those things coming together, we can discuss and exchange and trade, right? And so that's almost like the spiritual, in a sense, the spiritual foundation, the fact that we know that there is another out there that we can relate to, right? We might even dislike that other, but the fact that we know that there's another that we can relate to is what makes the trade possible.
Yeah, so I love Smith as well. And that passage is one that is just so like criminally misinterpreted. And I really think you put it well there that, Smith's whole point is you actually need to step out of yourself and communicate, why should this person care about what you're selling? Right? You have to think about their interests, their self-love. And he says he actually contrasts this with the Scottish Highlander, who has to be his
Mhm.
own butcher, baker, and brewer, and is, as a result, desperately poor. Right? So he said, if you want to live a totally egoistical existence, you can be a Highlander, and you'll be, deeply poor and isolated. And that's not to him where the wealth of nations comes from. So it's almost the exact opposite than the typical reading of him.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I can imagine that a Scottish Highlander doing being the butcher, baker, and brewer would literally be starving himself to death just because of the amount of work he had to do to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there is this
Yeah.
deep within just at the basis of social science and certainly economics is that we need one another, right? That, if we didn't need one another, there'd be no exchange. We could just do it all ourselves, and then there'd be no reason to have a science of economics. So there, ironically, there's kind of this very um, atomistic conception of society assumed for the science itself to be possible in the first place. And I think that's definitely something Frank would agree with.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up. I read this book last week, which is How the Dismal Science Got Its Name by David Levy.
Oh,
Which David Levy was one of my professors at George Mason, which is he's one of the most incredible people to talk to because he'll say something and in the moment you'll go, this is a madman talking to me. But then 5 years later, it's like the most illuminating thing I've ever heard. I took an econometrics class with him when I was an undergrad, and he was talking about Socrates at random moments. And like he's like, this regression that we're going to run, this is Socrates. And I was like, what are you talking about? But and now I think I kind of get what he was saying later. But he's a historian of economic thought primarily. And what
Mm,
this book is about is on one hand, it's about the story of why Thomas Carlyle basically used the dismal science to refer to economics in the context of the slavery debate, right?
hmm
Um, so that's the surface level what the book's about. But really, I think a lot of what it's about is Levy saying that, especially classical economics, took on exactly the view that you were talking about, that what humans are, or one way of defining a human, is an exchanging animal, the speaking and exchanging animal. So the one
Yeah.
who's able to relate to others and then organize ourselves based on those relations to sort of reveal both our individual and social natures through that process, right?
You
hmm
know, when you were talking about the examples of butcher, baker, and brewer, I was like, that's all food.
Uh-huh.
And then the one thing that separates us from animals is that we share food.
Huh.
mm, mm,
And it's a form of hospitality, actually, right? Like this
Mm,
is why hospitality is so important in the scriptures. You
mm.
know, this is where Rublev gets the Trinity,
mhm.
okay, from
Yeah.
hospitality.
Yeah.
So anyway, just a random.
Yes, and that's actually that chapter, that chapter two, that's how it ends, where he says what's different about humans and animals is that we are able to um, you know, divide up our separate talents and then bring our goods into a common stock. So right
Yeah.
after he talks about that passage, which is supposedly all about self-interest, he talks about the produce that we all make from this whole thing as one large common stock. Now, of course, some people are going to have higher incomes than others. Some wages are higher than other. That's a maybe a secondary question, and injustices can develop from that. But there is this notion that what the whole is something being done by the whole, but you have to understand it from the perspectives of individuals coming together. So that yeah, that's it's
That is the basis of the Eucharist too, right? Thine own from thine own.
hmm
You know, like it's like the bread and the wine are not natural. They have to be made. you know.
Mhm.
Yes,
They're
St.
made,
Nicholas Cobasilas says exactly this. He says,
yeah,
why not grapes and wheat?
right.
Because bread and wine require human labor.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
That's
so it's a
awesome.
well, Tolkien would call it a co-creation with God. It's
Hmm.
co-creating, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
participating, sharing food,
Yeah.
communion. That's what that
Hmm.
is, you
Hmm.
know? So anyway. Hmm.
And the way that Levy describes too the perspective of economics is that, well, one way he describes, he talks so strange, but it's so amazing when you listen to him talk. He goes, did society begin with an exchange, or did it begin with a command? Right? Carlyle, who's defending British slavery or kind of post-slavery relationships with the freed slaves in Jamaica, the society is about a command. It's about the higher races sort of leading the lower races in a certain direction, right? Whereas Adam Smith and the other economists are, oh, it's about different people who are equal coming together, exchanging, and then finding something else out. So when I was reading Levy's book, the question that kept coming through my mind was, okay, so what's the Christian story, the Bible? What does that begin with? Does it begin with an exchange or a command? On one hand, it begins with a command, let there be light. But then I was like, is that a command? He's saying, let there be light, and then the world is responding. And then the relationship between Adam and Eve, to what degree is that an exchange or a command? After sin comes in, then there's a more of a hierarchical relationship between male and female, and that's seen as perhaps necessary, but a degeneration from the condition they were in the garden. So there's so many things to think through there.
I got another little random thought about that. First of all, in German, it would probably be let light be,
Mm.
Huh.
right? So it's permission
Uh-huh.
Mm.
to become
Yeah, that's cool.
something. The
Mm.
other thing that I was thinking of, oh, I just lost it. Oh, dominating, dominion, and tending. I heard a
Mhm.
rabbi talk about this one time, that the commandment for Adam was to have domination, but also to tend,
Mm.
right? And that seems to me to be the tension that society finds itself in all the time, you know. And I just, if I bring that down to my level, being in a vegetable garden, you know, I once put it this way, when I go into the garden, I don't decide what I'm going to do. The garden tells me what to do.
Mm.
I'm the steward,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
And I go, oh, okay, I have to pick the raspberries or the strawberries. So I'm tending, right? And then I look at something else and I got to rip those weeds out of there because, and then I'm dominating. And so
Mm.
you're constantly moving back and forth between the two roles, and one cannot exist without the other. You can't
Mm.
just dominate, otherwise you'd be trampling all your raspberries and trampling all your strawberries, and ruining your harvest. So anyway, I don't know if I'm interrupting, but I just have this nagging question because you mentioned, Dylan, in the beginning, you talked about the law, and I don't
Hmm.
remember in what context, and you talked about exile,
Hmm.
and I don't remember how you saw those two related, and I just wanted to ask because
Oh,
serendipitously, I wrote a comment
yeah.
on a Substack this morning that kind of dealt with that, and I just wondered if
Okay.
on the same wave.
So, I mean, I can comment on that. I wasn't quite relating those two earlier.
Okay.
It was more exile in terms of Frank's biography,
Oh,
and
okay.
where it comes up in his thought is when he talks about the world. I guess you could say even our
It's not his
community
home.
that's become bereft of that inner unity, that subornos. So maybe obtres venos for that. This is we're gonna make it work. It'd be like if you had just law, right, but no
Yeah.
gospel, and even more so if you had, perhaps even a dysfunctional law or dysfunctional adherence to a good law. Um, we can think about that biblically, of course, that you have a law given in the garden: do not eat. Right? Fast, actually, right? And then Adam and Eve break the law and they are exiled. And
Yes.
then
Yeah.
God calls a community to himself in Israel and he gives them a law. And then when they break the law, they are sent into exile, right?
Right.
So that's I think where maybe law and exile are connected. And
Well,
a lot of this stuff I think you can see in the background of Frank's thought, but it's not always as explicit. But he does talk about subornos in terms of grace in the gospel,
Yeah.
right? And obtus venos in terms of law. And there's this interesting one of the things I like about his thought. We've already touched on it, but I just love how balanced it is,
Yeah.
because he seems really sensitive to Christ's preaching that he comes not to abolish the law but to fulfill it.
Right.
He also relates this, as another example. He talks about Christ's comment to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. And so he says, for example, the followers of Tolstoy, Tolstoy, and so Leo Tolstoy, the novelist, also wrote some religious literature, ethical literature, which was probably not quite as brilliant as his fiction. And one of the criticisms among a lot of people like Frank and other contemporaries is that it's too idealistic and too romantic. It basically absolutizes that subornos, the grace side of things, to the exclusion of the mechanical law side of things. And he says, the danger when you do that is you end up confusing the two.
Hmm.
And you can go the other way too, where you can say, well, what we're going to do, the opposite is true. Like the kind of utopians, they say, well, we're going to abolish all evil by taking control of the political power and running it the way we want to run it and writing the laws we want to run. And in both cases, you have this kind of idealized understanding of things that has to deny a whole aspect of our social life and for Frank, even our being. And the reality, it's both of those things. And what we need is a harmonized, proper relationship between them. One of the many terms that I think makes him not an easy read, but it's helpful to kind of grasp your mind around it. Is he talks about he says reality is a series of antinomian monodualisms, which could only come out of German idealism, right? But it's great. His point being
I love that.
yeah, an antinomy is like two coincidences of opposites,
Yeah.
right? So
Hmm.
monodualism is literally one and two
Yeah.
jammed together. Um, and he actually describes these in somewhat Chalcedonian terms. He says that these aspects of life should be um, uh, unmerged but inseparable, right? And the definition of Chalcedon says that Christ is both God and man without division, confusion, separation, or change. And so Christ is ultimately the pattern. Christ is the perfect embodiment of all this, the fulfillment of all of this. He is, if we want to see what it should look like, we look to him, we look to his community, his leadership in the Gospels, and certainly, the church following him, although church is full of people who are not quite as perfect as Christ. So there's some of that negative in our history too. But that's kind of the type that he sees for all of society. And yeah, again, I when I first read Frank, it was really refreshing to me. I think the closest experience I had was maybe before that when I first read Vladimir Solovyov,
Mm.
because I was working at Acton. I started there 15 years ago, and Acton's ecumenical, and they really encouraged me to do research from within my own tradition. And so I said, great. And I was reading all this stuff from Roman Catholics and Calvinists about their social thought, but I couldn't really find much from an Orthodox perspective. And then I found Solovyov, and he talks about law and economics. And when he talks about our relationship to the material world, he starts talking about asceticism. And I said, oh, good. Like this was my like
Yeah.
intuition, but now I know I'm not just making it up, right?
Right.
And Frank, I think, just is that times 10 or whatever. That he
Oh,
there's
okay.
a lot of the things that I kind of was drawn to anyway, or
Yeah.
maybe was trying to thread together from reading the fathers, that suddenly I just found complete and whole and integrated in his thought in this really inspiring way. So I don't think he's perfect necessarily, but just incredibly insightful and rewarding to me to return to.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking of when you were talking about law and exile is that exile is really important in Judaism, actually.
Mm,
Um, I just know I have a few Jewish friends, and I know very little about, the underneath of it all. But on the surface, it's what separates the Zionists from the non-Zionists, right? That
mm,
Israel is in exile, and there's a purpose in the exile, right?
mm,
So, but anyway, I wrote this comment because somebody wrote a Substack this morning that was really good. It was a great essay on just it's actually was actually talking a lot about economics, the overburdened debt that people are under at this
Mm.
point in time. And I'm just going to read you this and just kind of let it speak for itself.
Okay.
My comment was, it's time for a Jubilee year.
Mm.
I don't know if you guys have ever thought about that, but you're also, and then I wrote, I quoted from Leviticus, you are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, you should sound the horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family.
Mm.
You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. So that's
Mhm.
Leviticus 25, 8 to 11. And then I wrote, the Babylonian exile is directly related to the number of years the Israelites failed to keep this law.
Yes. Yep.
And then I wrote a quote from George MacDonald, who I absolutely love, and I've got glasses on my head and glasses here. These on. The natural world has its laws, and no man must interfere with them in the way of presentment any more than in the way of use. But they themselves may suggest laws of other kinds, and man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own, with its own laws, for there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest, perhaps, he can come to creation. When such forms are new embodiments of old truth, we call them products of the capital I imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I would call them the work of the fancy, capital F. In either case, capital L law has been diligently at work. His world once invented, the highest law that comes next into play is that there shall be harmony, integral, between the laws by which the new world has begun to exist. And in the process of his creation, the inventor must hold by those laws. The moment he forgets one of them, he makes the story, by its own postulates, incredible. To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken,
Mm.
we fall out of it. My favorite line in the MacDonald quote is the last one. He is writing about fairy tales, but he is also writing about the fall. To be able to live a moment in the imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it.
Mm.
Hmm.
So I put those together, and then my final statement was the greatest loss of modernity is the loss of capital I imagination.
Hmm.
And
I
I think they all weave together actually.
I do too. Yeah. So one of the things that's maybe in the background that I don't, if you're not familiar with like, modern philosophy, Enlightenment thought, probably particularly German thought, it might not be as easy to see. But one of the kind of results of Descartes and a lot of the philosophy following him is you have this mechanistic view of the world. And there's been some fruit of that. Like the modern scientific revolution comes out of that. But there were people, again, within German thought, and I think this is where you see some continuity in Frank's thought. They really pushed back against that. And they said, actually, the world is more like an organism. That there's this kind of this error that because we now have machines, this is our metaphor. And you can see the
Mhm.
same sort of thing happening. I can't remember the paper, but there's this guy Nagel who's a more recent philosopher, but he talks about
Oh, I've
or
seen.
no, sorry, maybe I'm thinking of Searle. I don't know, one or the other of them. But they talk about how now that we have like computers, suddenly everybody's like, maybe the world's a big computer, and he's like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, no, no. Like
Or
whatever it is,
video
it's
games and we
yeah.
live in a
Yes,
simulation.
exactly. It's that is like such a contracted view of
Brutal.
things. And what's interesting, I think, about someone like Frank is that he, on the one hand, pushes back. He says there's so much more to reality than what can be measured. The objective facts of life. But yet he still thinks those matter. right? There's still that place for the external obtus venos, community or social life, but it has to be put in balance, harmony. It has to be that integrity for it to be healthy. And so, yeah, again, yeah, I really think that that fits with that George MacDonald quote as well. That like the laws matter, and if you don't have a baseline of justice in society, you don't have room for mercy. I think you see that in the Jubilee, right? You had to have the law, people had to follow the law, and then the law made space
From
for a certain amount of mercy. So even things like, um, it still might be complicated, and it's we don't just have the Old Testament, but even things like slavery in the Old Testament, usually it was to pay off a debt. And slaves were supposed to be freed in the year of Jubilee, right? So no slavery was permanent or supposed to be permanent.
Hmm.
And that really makes it a different sort of reality. We might still object to the way in which it played out or whatever. But again, we have the gospel and not just the law anymore. But it still shows that it's not so simple. It's not just, the ancient Hebrews version of brutal paganism. There's something really radically different about
yeah.
the law of God.
And it's also from a spiritual perspective, it's every 7 years. It's the eighth year,
Yeah.
eighth
Mm.
day. It's the right?
Mm-hmm.
The Sabbath. It's the world to come, It's all that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as Orthodox Christians, we all know how important it is to act things out,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So does Judaism actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so we act it out because that's the only way we can actually bring it into our bodies, in my opinion,
Mm.
right? And this is the other thing that I keep seeing in this discussion is, you've got sobernost and you've had, what's the other word?
Obches venos.
Objection.
Oh, chesbenost.
Yes.
And it seems like you've got head and body,
Mm. You would
right?
say soul and body, but
Or
yes.
so, okay,
Yeah.
noose then,
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
which is that seed in the dark,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
But then that's always kind of been a thing for me. Like I've thought a lot about this over the years. Just how come I'm so disconnected from here
Mm.
to here?
Mm.
Like St. Paul talks about that, right? And one of the attractors for me to the Orthodox Church was the integral concept of worship,
Mm.
bringing the head and the body to a place together, to move together, where and it's also an unknowable space because there's things you can't see. There's smells and sight, sounds, and you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you could look at them
Mm-hmm.
if you wanted to, but they're surrounding you. It's a sensual experience, right? And so your whole being is pulled into a remembering,
Mm.
a
Mm-hmm.
remembering, right? It's like, remember? Remember? You know, I have a friend who his experience in coming into Orthodoxy, he's a winemaker and he has a distillery. And he said he was looking to put incense taste into some liquor that he was making.
Mm.
And so he just kind of Googled who knows the most about incense. And it came up Orthodox Church. So he went to see a priest, right? And to ask him about incense. And the priest was all thrilled, and he's pulling out his drawers and he's explaining. Well, in that experience, he ended up becoming an Orthodox Christian because he appreciated the sensual experience. He was a winemaker, he was a distiller, he was into smells and taste and right.
Mm-hmm.
But not only that, he had a keen memory because he had a keen olfactory system. Like, like this is really how it works, right? Because that's where your memory is really woken up is through smell.
Mm.
Mhm.
And so one of the things in conversation with him that I realized was, oh man, like you're standing in an Orthodox liturgy, which I've only done a few times, but I'm always there in my mind.
Mm.
And you've got candles made of beeswax, and you've got incense made of tree sap, right? And I don't know, there was a couple of other things that came to my mind,
Mm.
but you're standing. Oh yeah, and you got the dome if you're in a
Mm,
traditional church, right? And the stars, and you're standing in creation.
mm,
Like this is why people, when they go outside, now they call it forest bathing, unfortunately, so disconnected. But they go outside and they have a refreshing, right? Their spirit feels filled up
mm,
because the whole body is bringing in creation,
mm,
which Florensky and Bulgakov, and I'm sure Frank would agree, is
mm,
wisdom.
mhm,
And that wisdom has to be embedded in your body,
mm.
Like this is, and I mean, yeah, I could just go on and on about this.
Okay.
Stop talking.
I've got two things. The well, actually, first, I guess your friend, does he now do make wine for the liturgy?
No, I don't think so.
Well, an
I'd have to
opportunity
ask him.
maybe.
I'd have to ask him.
Yeah. But the you mentioned when you were talking about the Jubilee
Mm.
that one of the things that people do when the bonds are released is go back to their family,
Yeah,
right?
I know. That's,
And,
yeah.
and I don't know, I would encourage people to check the veracity of this elsewhere, but my friend Curtis Hingle was looking at something related to Dylan, you'd know Liberty Fund, right?
Mhm,
As is a, I guess classical liberal publisher in the United States. And in all of their books that they published, in the cover and in their symbol, they have this cuneiform from ancient Sumeria symbol that for this word amagi, which is I guess can be translated liberty. But Curtis was telling me he learned it can be more directly translated as the return to mother, right?
hmm,
Meaning that I think it had to do with someone being released from their debts, right? So
mm,
the word liberty has is related to this returning to your condition of freedom in some way, right? So
hmm,
the process of being released from debts in some way. And so another, and then related to what you're saying about uh, soul and body, if sobernos is the invisible soul which animates, I don't know if the soul or spirit would be what animates, but the the invisible part of your being united to the visual, maybe a little bit more mechanical body, right? One interesting thing that he brings up towards the end that I don't know exactly where it fits is the concept of the state, right? So
mhm,
where exactly does that fit in? Because the way that he talks about it is, well, you can have a society that's almost like a pre-state society, right? That they all have relationships to each other and there's a genuine whole there that's not organized or planned out by anyone. But on occasion, that society might run into a snafu, maybe an awkward moment, maybe an emergency, an invader, right? And through the mind of one individual or one group of individuals, he talks a lot about, like, say, a charismatic leader saying, or almost observing, perhaps from their own private position, observing the whole and saying, I'm now going to organize us, maybe as a military, maybe, to fight a natural disaster or something like that. So the state sort of emerges from a society and then is part of ordering it. Now, if you make a mistake and say, well, that's when the society began, is when the state began, right?
mhm,
Then you are mistaking what the obsessionost for what the sobernost actually originally provided, right? But that doesn't mean you
mm,
get rid of the state or you have to completely ignore things like that. So
mhm,
perhaps, and this is a stretch, perhaps maybe that's the role of more where more where you use the regular sense of a mind, right? Where, oh, I have an intellectual problem. I'm going to try to resolve this issue with, hey, I've got my schedules and my calendars, and I'm going to organize my body and what I do and my purposes this way. And at the social level, that might be something like the state. But he's very, very clear that there can be a problem that the state can introduce its own problems if it mistakes its role, if it mistakes sort of where it got its nutrients and sunlight and such from, right, then it will undermine the thing that it's supposedly trying to unite or trying to direct or fix, right? So I wonder too, it would be interesting to see to do something analogous in ecclesiology because there's parts of the church that are certainly based on sober nous,
mhm.
and then there's parts where, oh, that's the church, that's the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
He's in charge of the church, that guy, he's the bishop, right?
Yeah, he definitely does this with the church, and I don't know. I feel like some theologians might not totally like his
Uh-huh.
ecclesiology. But so actually, I don't know if I can share. I might
Oh,
try to
sure.
share my screen because I have a table that kind of is a great little shorthand. At least I think it is. I made the table though, so I'm a little biased, but a great little shorthand for his thought and how there's this, you know, antinomian monodualism, this duality to all these different things. So let me see if I can
Yeah.
share
You
the
should be able to
chart.
share. Yeah.
And there's ecclesiology is on here. Um, so let me know if you can see it. Hopefully it'll come through for your viewers as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the paper walks through all of these things and all the subsections. And so you have beginning with logic, he talks about, the identity principle is just A equals A. So what could it possibly mean to say, well, A is a B? That's almost a contradiction. He says, well, it has, he kind of gets into this nuance that there's a relation between A and B, that where A is, you find B, or that they're linked
Mhm.
together in some way. And then I added this kind of negative AB, just in terms of if you don't have that, you have a dissolution, you have something illogical. And so you can go through epistemology, ontology. So we were talking about society, right? Freedom, solidarity, service, each other. We didn't quite use those terms, but maybe even ethics, the grace and law, right? You see that. But if you go up to ecclesiology, he has this concept of mystical church. And this is just the idea of our connection with one another and with God, no matter who we are, and to some degree, no matter where we are. So he cites some of the early church fathers who say things, like Justin Martyr, who says, anyone who lived according to the Logos, reasonably, right? But Christ is the Logos, was a Christian. So, for example, Socrates and Heraclitus, and then he later on talks about Plato, and those are the exact examples that Frank uses as well. But he says, on top of that, there is an empirical church, right? There's kind of, we might say, the institutional church. And this church needs order and it needs laws and it needs a hierarchy. And that's just necessary to its functioning. And it's an error to confuse the empirical church with the mystical church, right? To conflate those. But at the same time, it's an error in a kind of Tolstoyan, or maybe, in our context, we might say like an Anabaptist way, to say that we don't need that, right? We just need this kind of anarchic community. And he says, really, you need this. They're united in the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. That if, whatever our conviction is, when we think in those terms, it has to be both these things together. And he says when you don't have that, you have, kind of idolatry or an abomination. So he definitely does apply that to ecclesiology as well. And again, I don't know that everyone would be totally
Mhm.
comfortable with his ecclesiology, but it's at least insightful. I think he is touching on some true things, even if the whole might not be there.
Yeah, and the way you talk about it in your paper is, well, somebody might be worried that sometimes the way that he talks, or the way that really any Orthodox Christian or most Christians would talk, some kind of unity between God and man broaches some kind of pantheism, right? And so
Hmm.
we never want to say that God and man have the same nature. We don't become God when we, go through theosis. But you do have to say that, well, the kingdom of God, that is something that both God and us are a part of. What is the kingdom of
Hmm.
God? It's the name for the whole relation that we have together. We are both in not it's not we wouldn't say that we both are equally parts of, but we don't have equal parts of the kingdom of God. We don't
Right.
have equal roles in the kingdom of God. So that it makes sometimes people think of, well, you do theology and then you might have some social theory, and that's like practical lessons from, right? But in the
Right.
way that Frank talks about it, the social relations are part of really understanding the more basic relationships. These social categories are necessary. They're not secondary.
Yes, for him, I mean, again, it is all integral, and you just can't divide these things for him. That's why, like I said, like every one of his works. So, you guys read a few selections from The Spiritual Foundation of Society. That is his
Hmm.
social philosophy. But he also has The Unknowable, which is his religious philosophy. It also talks about social issues by the end.
Yeah.
His political philosophy is The Light Shineth in Darkness.
Mm.
Again, you would expect that there, but even his kind of personal confession, God with us, he's getting into these things, not just the ecclesiology, but talking about social ethics. And he's just one of these thinkers that wasn't content to just stop right? To say, well, I figured out this one thing in this one aspect. He wanted to explore all of the implications to it. And that gives him this really remarkable consistency to his thought.
Hmm.
Mm. Looking at the ecclesiology, the mystical church and the empirical church are antinomical, actually.
Right. Right.
Oh
Yep.
yeah, all of these are antinomies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. And, one of the things I do a weekly show with a friend called Lives of the Saints. And that's what we do. We go through the lives of the saints, my church.
Mm.
And and one of the things that really struck me when I started on that journey, we've been doing it for almost 2 years now, actually, is the antinomical nature of the Synaxarion to the empirical church. Because
Mm.
I would call the lives of the saints the mystical church, right? It's
Hmm.
mythological in its nature. And there are things in the stories of the lives of the saints that would probably not go over very well with the empirical church.
Hmm.
I didn't immediately come to the conclusion that, oh, okay, well, they're contradicting each other, you know. But but I looked at it instead as how do these things serve each other? It's like dominion and tending in the garden. They're antinomical in nature, but they serve one another, right? And so how does the mythological, mystical aspect of the lives of the saints serve the empirical church? Well, it holds it accountable. And this is why I like what Marcus has done with the work he's done on monasteries, for example,
Yes.
right? Um, and and of course, I mean, the golden thread through Florensky's Pillar and Ground of the Truth is asceticism,
Mm.
which is again that seed in the dark, right?
Hmm.
It's that, I mean, when I read the stuff that you sent along from Frank, one of the things I saw was that in order to have any kind of civil coherence, you have to have an inner coherence,
Hmm.
right? Like spiritually speaking, you can't just
Yes. Yes.
you know wander. It's like Jordan Peterson criticizing all the activists, who can't get up in the morning and get a job, but they're out there with their placards.
Mm.
It's the whole clean your room and then,
Right.
right? It's the same
Or your
idea,
office, clean
really.
your office, you could say too. Yeah.
So anyway, I just
Yeah.
I love the idea of
Go
antinomy.
on because this is the major focus of my
Oh,
own research is kind of asceticism in Orthodox social thought.
Yeah.
Um, it says my connection's unstable. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in
oh,
case that
okay.
helps.
Okay.
But if I want to have a relationship with another human being, at some point I need to stop talking and I need to listen, right? You have to deny yourself, not because there's something about you that's bad, but in order to be more, in order to have communion, you have to be able to say no to yourself. And this relates, of course, to our social life as well. There's that just I don't think there's any human community that isn't ascetic at its basis if we understand it in those terms.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also in terms of how much need do we have for that obches venost, right? So uh, you know, Frank talks about that, the laws of a society need to be adapted to the moral culture and character of the people.
Mhm.
And, you can find this in, like Edmund Burke says basically the same
Hmm.
thing, that the more you have that kind of spiritual maturity and development and community, the less you really need the external constraints that are there to kind of be safeguards to draw a line, say, this far is too far, and that also to me is again reflects that understanding of why the law is necessary but insufficient. Right? The law doesn't save us. It just keeps us from falling farther. Right? What we need is something far greater. We need, the divine life, right? We want that theosis, that deification, and we need grace to do it, just like we need the rain and the sun to grow those crops.
Hmm. Yeah, well, Sherry, I was going to mention this earlier, but you'd be happy to know that um, Hayek, one of the other metaphors that Hayek is the most well known for is to say that the state ought to be a gardener, right? Or he doesn't say the state so much so directly, but that society should be thought of as a garden in which there are many things that have to be ordered that have very complex relationships to each other, which are not obvious to the naked eye,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes you can learn some things, you get some science or whatever, and then you learn some things, but whatever. But you don't know the whole. You don't know the whole, but you do know that there's certain things that you can do. There's certain rules that you can set. Hey, maybe we're going to put a barricade between these two things. Hey, maybe we're going to till up this ground or remove these particular weeds, right? That we can identify against the potatoes, right? And then the rest will do its own voluntarily, right? So the role of the state, the role of the intentional planning in society should be only in these circumscribed areas so that the rest can do its job. So it's the purpose of planning is to let the unknown parts of the world relate to each other properly, right?
Right.
And that seems to be the same basic philosophy that he develops about the state and even the way that he describes the best version of liberalism, right? When he talks later on, he calls it liberalism or Manchesterism, which was kind of like the German basically a sneer word for certain kinds of British economics, right? They
Right.
thought, oh, this is just, this is the economics for the people that built that thing, Manchester. Manchesterism obviously should not apply to Berlin, right? We need our own science, we need our own state to build up things and organize. And actually, Karl Menger, who's thought of as the founder of Austrian economics, wrote an article not in defense of Manchesterism, but defending Smith against certain caricatures of Manchesterism, saying this is not the way that Smith thought. This is the way that maybe certain British economists thought, but not Smith. Um, and yeah, and the way that he describes, because also right towards the end, he's talking about when he talks about what one of the things that we need the state and the law for is private property. He has the whole section on private property. What does he really think that private property is there for? My interpretation is something like um, each person who has a connection to Sobornos through their own subjective experience, right, is going to need some kind of space in which they know the other planning, ordering parts of society are not going to interrupt them, are not going to rip up the things that they're trying to settle so that they can act, so that their experience can be part of, you might even want to just call it the data, being input into this larger social process. You actually need liberty to get the data to do the fuller thing, right?
Mm.
Mm.
And that's exactly what Hayek says too, basically. That in the Constitution of Liberty, the whole purpose of private property to him is to give each person what he calls a private sphere of
To,
stable relationships, right?
to tend and dominate.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say. So yeah, Frank. He talks about Manchesterism and liberalism, and it's so interesting because he doesn't want to say that it's like that's all you need and it's right, but his way of criticizing it is just that it has the wrong philosophical foundation. So he's like
Mhm.
the things that they say tend to be good. They just think they have the wrong basis for thinking those things. So things like atomistic individualism and whatnot. And yeah, it's just another example where, like you said, there's all these parallels to Hayek and the Menger and some other economists. And I don't know the extent, but I do know that before Frank chose philosophy, he actually did study political economy. Now, who
Okay.
knows what they were teaching in Russia or Berlin, depending
Yeah.
on where he was studying. But he also had a lifelong friend, Peter Struve, who was Russian Orthodox economist,
Huh.
and he was a liberal in the classical sense. So you also probably have some benefit to Frank, even I think more so than Sergei Bulgakov, Father Bulgakov, who was an economist, but he was a Marxist economist who then left Marxism. So he rejects, I think, a lot of the right things, but he kind of only gets halfway there in terms of at least what the mainstream economics discipline would say sometimes. And Frank doesn't always dwell enough on the economic side to really be able to tell for sure. But usually when he comments on it, it does seem a bit more, I don't know if they're the right word. What's the Bettke's term in terms of mainline or
Mainline
mainstream? Yeah,
economics.
so he feels pretty
Yes.
mainline to me.
Yes.
He might not be the most, in depth, have the most in depth knowledge, but he has like some baseline that he's working with. And like I said, he is constantly going back to social questions, social problems, social implications of his thought.
Mhm.
And I think that comes through.
So
Yes.
if he spent time in Germany, a long time sounds like,
Yeah.
do you know how influenced he might have been by Goethe? I'm just wondering.
Oh, he cites Goethe. Yeah.
Oh,
So there's a whole aspect that I didn't get into because
yeah.
my paper is just trying to show, especially Orthodox theologians
Yeah.
and others, that hey, this guy isn't just a quirky modern philosopher. That there's actually this patristic grounding to his thought.
Right,
But
right.
you could equally, and there was Father Paul Sewers. He was there when I presented the paper, and
Mm.
he's a literature guy, and so he was commenting about that kind of stuff. Like you could do a whole paper on. Um, Frank, the use of poetry in Frank. There's Goethe, there's Pushkin, of course, there's Solovyov actually wrote a ton of poetry as well,
Yeah.
and there's others too that he's just very widely read and very free with the sources he draws from. So yes, I mean he really cared about German culture, like intellectual culture, in a way that might be hard to appreciate. But he was really upset the unknowable. He actually originally wrote in German, but by that time things were so bad in Germany that no German press would publish it. So he had to rewrite the whole thing in
Mm.
Russian to find a publisher for it.
Uh-huh.
And that was it, to him it was like his magnum opus, and he was frustrated that like German philosophers were not really going to have access to it. Um, but so, things obviously changed in Germany, but for a long
Yeah.
time, um, one of my favorite passages, there's many, but of the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, he talks about how, Napoleon swept across Europe, um, militarily, right? The French were, trying to conquer
Yeah.
Europe in the 19th century, but the Germans really conquered Europe intellectually and artistically
Mm.
and culturally. If you think of music and philosophy and just literally every intellectual
Yeah.
discipline in the 19th century, just dominated by German names. And there was something great, genuinely great about that. Again, it took a bad turn, but
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
real insight there that I think very happily does get integrated into our faith through people like Frank and a lot of his contemporaries. They all were studying this stuff.
Yeah, my guess would be that in terms of his influences in Germany, based on the way that he's talking, especially the stuff about the state, I forget if he uses the word charisma or not, but Weber, it
Mm,
smells like Weber, a lot of
okay.
parts of especially the later parts on state and civil society, right?
Mm,
So, and Weber is super interesting because he's in some ways what's called the Methodenstreit, the debate between what becomes the Austrian school, Karl Menger, and the German historical school, which the German historical school is all about observation, measuring things based on their external, what are the relationships of this to this, and the Austrian school, which is focus on the subjective experience of one person and then how do these things relate or integrate through institutions. Weber is thought of as someone who integrates these perspectives, right? The Austrian school, the Mengerian approach, and then later the kind of the Misesian approach, can be criticized as maybe too individualistic, too much focused on one person's experience, so
mm.
such that it's hard to really describe how people actually end up talking to each other, which you kind of need. Whereas the German was too much about the whole. And that's also the way that he describes it in here. Two extremes would be seeing the world as atomistic or defining each person only in relation to the whole. And that's the tendency that goes towards socialism, of all parties, as Hayek would say.
Yeah, I think, there was not much overlap, but I also think of him in terms of at least his economic outlook reminds me of the German Ordo Liberal school. So
Yeah.
Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Röpke, the kind of the today we associated with the social market economy in Germany, but really I think its best achievement is the West German economic miracle, this recovery after World War II, to the point where within 5 years, suddenly it was the strongest economy in Europe. And so they had this balance where they really respected the insights of economics and economic life, but then they also really cared, and I think you see this in Smith, frankly, too. If you think of his two
Oh
major
yeah.
works, one is on morality and really moral culture, and the other is on economic exchange. And they really emphasize that you have to have both. And I think that, he does a great job balancing those things too.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I just read a quote from Saint Porphyrios yesterday. In order to become a Christian, you must first become a poet.
Mm,
Yeah, just, trying to, um, what do you call that? Support the idea that Frank was, free ranging, right?
right, right.
All
I,
good. So good.
Yeah, Vladimir Lossky in his mystical theology, he points out that technically the word in the creed, when it says, I believe in one God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, the word
Mhm.
maker in Greek is poetos or something like that, or
Yeah.
poietes, which
Oasis.
literally is poet,
Yes,
right?
it is. And
Um,
George
it-
MacDonald says that in his
yeah.
Imagination Essay. Poet means maker.
Yeah, so God is the poet of the heavens and the earth. And of course, he makes through speaking. Another passage I remember studying years ago in school was in Ephesians, where St. Paul says, You are God's workmanship. The word in Greek, it's really almost the only time it appears in the New Testament, is poema. It's literally,
Oh,
you are God's poem,
right.
Mm,
right?
Oh,
Um,
beautiful.
yeah.
that is
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and the Ethiopian church preserves that tradition. Did you know that?
No?
Yeah, they have, I think if you want to be clergy in the Ethiopian church, you have to do at least a year, maybe two, not sure, of a poetry school.
Wow.
And
Uh,
then before every liturgy, the clergy writes a poem, reads the poem, and then burns it.
Wow. Huh.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
very powerful.
Huh.
Yeah.
well, one thing that I don't ha I said before we started, I wrote 2 pages of notes, and we've taught we there's so much that we could go so deep in all of these things, but I think we've touched on most of them. One thought that I had though in the car today that you might be able to comment on, Dylan, is where would um where would Frank's concepts and terms help us understand the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's
Mm.
passage, right? Because I was thinking, somebody mentioned it in whatever I was listening to, and I thought, oh, is it easy to say that would this be overusing a category that the Obshestvenost category, the external world, the planned part of the world, to some degree, Caesar stamping his face on this currency means he's planning out this monetary system. I mean, a monetary system you don't exactly control, as Alex Salter would tell us, right? But at least there's some degree of ordering, planning when you mint certain coins. Could that be Jesus saying, "Well, some of these systems, they're there, use them when you need to. Don't don't
Yeah.
don't get too excited about it." But the real thing uniting all of us, the kingdom of God, right, is undergirding that and everything else.
That's definitely how Frank uses it. To be strict, I think in terms of biblical interpretation, you'd have to say, well, that's an implication, right, drawn from it. I do think Christ is actually talking about Caesar, to be
Uh-huh.
to be clear,
Yes.
right? Let's start there. Sort of like when people talk about idolatry and they immediately jump to metaphorical usage, and I always try to say, wait, wait, wait.
Yeah.
Remember the people were actually sacrificing animals to stones, like that. That did happen one time, and it was a big problem. So you do have to start there. But yes, I think that's how Frank's using it. I do think it's um, a legitimate use or implication, the idea that you have a law or a worldly order, and it's not necessarily bad just because it's not God's order, right? God can work through it. It can be opposed to him. We have plenty of martyrs that witness to that as well, and certainly Frank lived through some of the most horrifying instances of that. Um, but that's the idea, yeah. And so that would be how he understands it. That just as Christ says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When we look at our social life, we always have to pay proper respect to each of these things. That the externally ordered stuff, he's just not an anarchist at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Some people would not like that, but he just isn't. The externally ordered stuff does matter. You do need some, again, baseline of that to have a stable, just, orderly society. But if that's all you have, it's like the most uncaring, it's missing the most important vital things of anything. It's missing love, it's missing grace, it's missing mercy. Um, and I wouldn't exactly push back against Alex, but I do think he would agree that a good state actually manages their currency well and
Mm.
keeps it stable. And an example I give in my book that I think we don't talk enough about or know enough about, it was told to me by a friend, is the solidus. St. Constantine minted a coin
Mhm.
called the solidus, which kept its value till the 11th century.
Mm.
And that's really important because in the law, there are commandments about having stable weights and measures. Why? So that when you're having exchange, nobody's ripping someone off. If somebody's
Mhm.
worried that the coins that they're giving them to pay for their goods might be debased, they could go measure it against the temple coin. They could weigh it against
Mhm.
it and prove that, yeah, this is authentic. This is, 100% gold, whatever the case may be. And that ensured justice. It was a way of keeping the eighth commandment. You shall not steal. There's lots of ways to steal. Sometimes you're still paying somebody, but you're not paying them what you promised or what they asked
Mhm.
for. And that's really important, even in Christian society, right? We have to have a justice. That's one. Justice is, I guess, another way to put it, and I have that on the chart. Justice is a way of loving our neighbor. It's a really essential, important way. It's just not the only most important way, right?
Mhm.
Another way to look at it is the law is good. It's even perfect in terms of what it's for. But the gospel is true perfection. Christ says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And um, we're called to go to follow the laws, but to go beyond the law in our lives. And Christians were known for this in the ancient world. This is one reason why, the ancient martyrs in the ancient persecuted church just grew like wildfire. The more they were persecuted, the more people said, really, those guys? The people who are like running into the city during the pandemic and helping the sick instead of fleeing it and leaving their loved ones to die, like those are the people you're going to persecute? I'd rather just join them. And eventually it completely delegitimized a twisted external order, right? To
Mhm.
the point where it fell, and you have the emperor converting and now becoming part of that community for better and worse. It's complicated, right? But becoming part of that Christian community and genuinely changing the world. I don't think, we're so distant from it today. We really don't think about the impact enough.
Mhm.
It was a revolutionary thing.
You
And,
know,
and
oh,
well, another thing about the solidus, I don't know to what degree this is what really tipped it over the edge, but a lot of the original base metal that Constantine made the Solidus out of was from melting down the idols in pagan temples, from what I
Hmm,
understand, right?
hmm.
So that was and the currency problems was one of the huge issues of his predecessor, not exactly immediate predecessor, but his predecessor, Diocletian, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of, well, the government is responsible for money the way that Alex would want it to be is rules, not discretion, right? In
Hmm.
that when the government is in charge of managing and developing and stabilizing a monetary system, they ought to put constraints on themselves, right? Or well, we'd hope they'd put constraints on themselves. They ought to govern that system according to rules. That's the only way that liberty is possible, basically.
Hmm.
And the way that he starts really defining a good state, a state that does not interrupt or shred apart the things that Sobernost is bringing it, is a state that communicates, that behaves according to laws, that behaves according to stable relationships. Basically, when it does do the planning, that planning is not seen as arbitrary. So again, and that's very, very
Yep.
simpatico with the way that Hayek talks about the role of the state can do things, can override private property in certain situations, but not arbitrarily so, right? And that's
Hmm.
where real loss of freedom comes. But
mm,
yeah, go ahead, Cherry. Sorry.
oh, I was just thinking, I'm always thinking about the antinomical nature of, um, you would think of freedom through asceticism, right? This is what
Mm.
Florensky's, all about freedom through asceticism. And I just read the book that he wrote about his spiritual father, Father Isidore,
Oh, yes.
because apparently that was like where he got most of his insights.
Mm,
And um, it seems to me like, because I'm just thinking about these things simply, that if if social experiments never quite work out the way the social scientist wants them to, they think, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to push people over here. And I mean, I get it because I'm a farmer and I have livestock, and so I'm always doing little social experiments on them. Let's move them over here. Let's see if we can get them, through the sheep dip without anybody breaking a leg. How do we, how do you manipulate a group without invoking fear?
mm,
This is really what what they're doing, with society most of the time, right? It's a herding thing. And if you're a shepherd of sheep, then you're always contending with this problem, right? And again, it's tending and dominating,
mm,
right? Tending and dominating. But oftentimes, what social scientists find is that they try something out and they get the opposite effect. And I've been there. I'm like,
mm.
okay, we're going to do this today with the sheep, and then you do something, and they're all gone, and that's the end of your day because you just ruined it and you don't know how. You know? Um, and so it's why I like antinomy so much because it seems like when you push something in a direction that you would think like asceticism, for example, that would there would be so many constraints that the person might, rebel against it, which happens, but essentially it brings freedom, right? If you give yourself to it, right? You have to get like
Mhm,
you have to empty yourself towards that thing. And I don't know why I got on that track, but it was something you guys were talking. Oh, I know. The give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's. To me, that feels like that.
mm,
There, ultimately, as Christians, I think we should be have enough faith to know that God is actually in control of Caesar, right?
mm.
So, so when you submit to Caesar, you can still the kingdom of God is within you. You're still submitting to God. You can
Mm,
subvert Caesar by
mhm,
submitting to God, right?
Mhm.
mhm,
And allowing those constraints. Maybe the taxes are too high. Maybe your property's been taken away, right? Okay, so now I'm in the place where I have to give myself to the constraint to find out what it is, where my freedom is,
mm,
right?
mhm,
Mhm.
Because that's the only way you can do it. And I'm saying all this, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about my decision to become Orthodox.
mm,
So like I was raised in an evangelical home, but I didn't really have a grounding in it. I just had a very chaotic childhood
mm,
and tried going to church when I had little children, me and my husband, but then ended up just saying, "Ugh, no, can't do this anymore." And we were homesteading and living in the woods and all this stuff. And I just continued my journey with God in the woods, basically, just learning from nature and talking to God all the time. I didn't deconstruct. I didn't hate God. I didn't become an
mm,
atheist for 23 years.
mm,
And then suddenly I was confronted with orthodoxy, which I had not, previously never heard of. And I was like, oh, I think I need to go there. But why would I do that? Like it's so old, it's massive. It's like this monolith, it's this
mhm,
institution. But one of the things I knew I needed was I needed the constraints.
mm,
I had that mystical church. I didn't have
mm,
the empirical church that you
mm,
pointed out.
mhm,
And that's the antinomical nature of our reality of we have to contend with living in the tension between those two things because they bring the most fruit, actually.
mm,
So I just wanted to add that.
And while you were talking about that, I thought of another Russian, somebody that you might think of as someone who did just simply reject the empirical church, is like a Tolstoy,
Yeah.
Yep.
right? And his philosophy, which he names Christian anarchism, would fit the way that Frank talks about anarchism. Like, a group that thinks, oh, well, hey, aren't we all part of this whole silver nose thing? So isn't that just interrupting that? Isn't this just interrupting? So let's just get rid of it, ignore it, clean it all up, and then we're good, right? Then we're golden. Um, and then
Yeah.
and then he drifts off in his own direction. So I've got to leave in a few minutes, so I don't know if there's any final things to talk about. I mean, well, there's many final things to talk about, but anything that we want to get on the table today before we talk about Frank in the future.
Well, if you'll let me, I'd love to give just a little introduction if anyone wants to know more about the Institute.
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay. So, as Marcus said at the beginning, I'm president and founder of the St. Nicholas Cobastulus Institute. The goal is to bring scholars like Marcus, who's one of our research fellows, bring them together, Orthodox scholars who focus on, big issues of our modern world, things like religious liberty, democracy, capitalism, new technology, get them together, support their work, and then produce a volume every year of their lectures. And from that, start holding clergy retreats. So, on a diocese by diocese basis, with Episcopal approval. In fact, I founded this institute with the blessing of Metropolitan Nicholas of Detroit, who's my bishop. Always, that's the Orthodox way. That's part of Catholicity and Sobornos, according to St. Ignatius of Antioch, is respect for the bishop. Going clergy, diocese by diocese, having clergy retreats. So, engaging priests and deacons with this work, but also getting their feedback. So it's a two-way sort of thing. So we can have that data that local knowledge we can't get any other way, and use it to inform our next year's scholars conference. And so we're trying to launch this. It's very, very new, and so we're looking to fundraise. We're looking to spread the word. I find that this is something I thought of because it's a need I think is unmet. And usually once I explain it to people, they say, "Oh yeah, we need something like this." But they weren't like me, for the last 15 years seeing all the Catholics and Protestants doing this sort of thing and feeling like they need this. They had to be introduced to it. And so spreading the word is huge. Again, any kind of donation would help. Our goals, I think, are actually pretty modest for these conferences. About 50,000 should cover our first one. And then, of course, most of all is prayer. I've been so humbled by how well everything has developed, and I really have no other explanation than the grace of God. So please, if you're watching this, pray. You can go to our website, cobasilusinstitute.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter. And, I try to write something every week or so, just to give an update on, something one of our fellows is doing, or just a reminder about, our ongoing fundraising campaign or something like that. But, anytime somebody reaches out, I say yes. I arrange a call. I'm happy to talk more with anyone who's interested. But it's something that, I see it as, among others, a way of reinvigorating, resurrecting the sort of work that S.L. Frank did. That he was just amazingly resilient, considering the life he went through. In any other period of history, he would have had a post at a university, and he would have had, countless doctoral students who would have perpetuated and built on his work. And instead, he was three times over a refugee, and yet he still produced all that he produced. But somebody needs to pick up the torch and run with it again. And I don't want to be on an island, and none of us scholars want to be. And we'll serve the church a lot better if we can be working together. And so that's the goal. Let's get us together and start serving the church, and hopefully that'll also include things, on the parish level, on the lay level as well. So just want to put in the little advertisement for the Institute. So
Yeah,
thank you.
hopefully we don't all have to get exiled to get our best ideas, but
Let's hope not.
if
Yes.
it's necessary, then
Right.
then God will do it for us. Yeah, thank you, Dylan. Thanks to Sherry. I knew you guys would get along, so um,
Yeah, great
I'll
meeting you, Sherry.
Yeah, you too. You too. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Marcus, for inviting me to the conversation. I feel like I'm way above my pay grade here, but it
no, it's great.
was really
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll see you around. Thank you. Bye.